Now, today we turn our attention, and for several days hereafter, to William Morris's translation of the story of the Volsungs, the Saga of the Volsungs. And of course, the reason we're reading this, you may have been asking yourselves why, but the truth of the matter is we're reading it because it is a text Tolkien would have encountered in more or less the version in which we have it. That is, he was a fan of William Morris from a young age forward, and certainly read whatever he could get his hands on, this material certainly included. But secondly, we're reading it because, of course, it is a reflex of the material Tolkien alludes to in fairy stories when he talks about Sigurd the Volsung and dragons and desiring dragons with the profound desire. He places this material, in fact, in that essay, in a hierarchical context, the top of which, in fact, is represented by this story and its characters. So we know it was very, very dear to him. We also know that as an Oxford academic, and in fact earlier than his Oxford years, he had learned to read Old Icelandic, which is the original language of this text, and himself is reported as having translated directly from it to a group he called the Coal Biters. This was a group of academics at Oxford that included C.S. Lewis, so there's overlap with the Inklings, who would meet periodically in the evenings, pick up Icelandic texts, and translate directly from them. Tolkien is reported to have held the text on his lap and read along and translated literally from the page in front of him, and he was the best of the group. So he learned it from Morris. He acquired Icelandic language in formal terms, translated it then himself, and we should stress, also, if you look at your book list for this class, you'll realize that he dabbled in writing a verse form of the legend of Sigurd on his own, which we will examine a little ways down the road. All that being said is mere preface to a discussion of matters which he himself found to be profoundly influential to him and profoundly interesting in and of themselves. Many of you have been in the Norse Saga, Myth, and Legend class, have you not? Right? Several of you were in there. And you may recall, of course, that we read a more modern translation, the translation by Jesse Byock, one of the most outstanding current scholars in the field, and author of many books, as well as several translations from the Icelandic. And you will recall, of course, that this is a sort of foundational narrative to much of what follows. Many of the Icelandic sagas, many of which are historical in origin, nevertheless either model themselves in part on this story or make regular reference to this story. So it is a compendium of myths well known to the Icelanders of the 10th through the 13th centuries, upon which they based many of their own narratives, or at least in those narratives made knowledgeable reference to this text. Why do we choose Morris's translation specifically? Of course, as you were reading it, you might have asked yourself that very question: why don't we just read a modern translation, right? This is from just a few years ago. We're reading Morris's, of course, as I said, because it was read by Tolkien, right? But what other kinds of virtues might reading this translation reveal to us? What other kinds of strengths might this, or at least revealing qualities, might this translation exhibit? As you were reading it, Sam, didn't you think it was kind of funny? I mean, odd? Why?
Well, I've never read anything else by Morris.
Yes.
But I thought it was
Or by the Icelanders, most likely, at this point. Yeah,
exactly,
okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
I thought it was very peculiarly
Yes.
written.
Yes, it has an odd structure.
Yes. And I also was like, there's so many names that begin with
Right,
S.
also true, yes. And even the element sig, which means victory, right? So there are a
Yes.
lot of names that begin with sig or have sig involved in them, and thus are in some sense related to the notion of victory. So partly the culture is alien to us, that's one. The world that is depicted in the text is alien to us. What else, however, seems to you odd about it? Noteworthy, striking. Joe, what do you think? As you're reading along in it, what occurs to you?
What occurred to me is that you can see a lot of similarities between all these epic stories that involve fantastical elements.
Yes. That part is interesting, is it not? Because not only is it, shall we say, closely connected with fairy stories in Tolkien's terms, but that particular essay also reminds us of the archetypal nature of certain recurrent motifs, although Tolkien really doesn't use the word very liberally. Archetypes are what he's referring to when he characterizes in his something unfortunate metaphor of the stock pot, the big cauldron of story in which constantly story elements are bubbling and overturning and recombining, and the storyteller who is a cook reaches in the ladle and doesn't just take things out at random, he says, but is selective, right, about what he gets out of the cauldron of soup. So this certainly reminds us of the archetypal nature of the contents of the cauldron. I think that's very useful in and of itself. We know that stories around the world are related in a variety of fundamental ways, and this particular story certainly exhibits some of those features. So well remarked, I think. What else?
It felt, so having read the more modern,
Yeah.
I didn't remember as many trolls in this, and there were some turns of phrase that I
Yes.
didn't remember.
Yeah.
Like man-child
Yeah.
stuck out as
Yeah.
a phrase that
Yeah.
might literally be the Icelandic, but
Right.
to the modern mind, it does not conjure,
That's right.
I think, the same image.
What Morris and his Icelandic collaborator, Eiríkur Magnusson, have tried to do, and I suspect this is rather at Morris's insistence than Magnusson's, what they've attempted to do is provide a nearly literal English equivalent to many archaic Icelandic phrases. And in so doing, they have been obliged, Morris certainly has been obliged, to reach back into English language history and draw into a modern translation texts and expressions and phrases that are not themselves modern. There's a name for these things. We will encounter this peculiar quality of narrative repeatedly in the stuff that we examine, because it seems to go hand in hand with the fantasy impulse as we currently understand it. When you deliberately make use of an out-of-date or obsolete term that in itself might very well pose such a challenge to your reader that subsequent editors find it necessary, not in this one, but subsequent editors might find it necessary to include a word list at the end. Yes, certainly there are endnotes in which some of these things are explained. That's absolutely right. But I've seen editions, if you have different editions, you may very well have this feature. I've seen editions of this translation in which the archaic words have to be themselves translated. So Morris is translating from a language not well known to his contemporaries in the 1870s and 80s in England. And in fact, he remarks in the preface that this is the first such translation. And he says, in essence, he's surprised by that. This is the first such translation of the Saga of the Volsungs into English. So he puts us, in a way, at a kind of disadvantage twice. Because on the one hand, he's got this alien and unfamiliar narrative from an alien and unfamiliar world, which, though he attempts to explain it in a minor way in the preface, nevertheless remains to some degree out of reach for us. Then I'm going to use the term now, he archaizes it. We might say in favorable terms that Morris has attempted to make an old tale sound old by using old English forms. But that helps to inaugurate a peculiar feature of fantasy. Fantasy literature, as we understand it, by way of Tolkien and on into more recent representations, is almost never saturated by any form of history but the European medieval. It is pre-technological, that is pre-industrial revolution. It is therefore already an exercise in archaism. So Morris seeks to mark that archaic worldview by giving us a number of archaic terms and making our reading experience initially more difficult, but I hope in the end more gratifying as well. Now, those of you who have read Tolkien, of course, will know that he is bitten by the same bug. He loves archaic words and turns of phrase, and the world that he characterizes in his fantasy is invariably quasi-medieval, pre-industrial revolution. And we know from On Fairy Stories his feelings about the Industrial Revolution and its products. So at this stage, what might we infer about the 19th century origins of modern fantasy literature from its archaism and medievalism? What might we infer? Go ahead, please, if you like.
Maybe it's a return to a simpler time?
Yes, right? We've already begun to talk in very small measure about the tendency of fantasy to yearn for a simpler time. To yearn for a time when you don't, as Tolkien phrases it, I'll quote him again, where you don't have to put up with the noise and the stench and the waste of an internal combustion engine, where you don't have to be assailed by modern mass-produced streetlights. All of that is in On Fairy Stories. So there is a yearning for a different, earlier, simpler time. With, I suppose, and this we must investigate closely, an attendant simplification of human affairs. As if, in fact, our technology had needlessly and harmfully complicated our affairs. So there is clearly a bias in favor of archaism, a bias in favor of escape to a simpler time, and also it would seem therefore a repudiation of post-18th century technology. These are all problematics when you pause to think about them at all. They're problematics in any of several ways. And I just want to put all of that on the table before we go on. Can you, for me, in the story being translated here by William Morris, identify the level of technology?
Their swords.
Yep. Go on.
And
Swords, spears, shields, armor, helmets, horses.
boats. Yeah, boats.
Yes, there are boats.
Horses. People live in castles.
Strongholds at any rate.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that in truth, the story he's translating already addresses itself, and he has chosen it partly for this reason, to his own peculiar yearnings for a simpler past time. So the level of technology is such as we have described it, pre-industrial revolution, and in fact overtly early medieval. Does that in turn entail a simplification of human affairs? You say no, and I'll come back to you as well, James. Go ahead, why not? This is the problematic. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
I thought, okay, so being a biology major, I tried to make sense of their little family lineage they have going on. And then I
Sure.
would like sneak in like, so I snuck in an excerpt about the magic that
Yes.
reminded me very much of Game of Thrones.
Yes.
And it was very, very complex. So
Yes.
I wanted to say, oh, this will be simple because it was a simpler time.
Sure,
And I was like,
but it isn't.
not at all,
Right,
not
right.
at all.
The paradox of this literature is that however much you may yearn for simpler, more direct, and more, shall we say, candid human relations, it would appear, in fact, that we have always been who we are. Our level of technology may exacerbate things in terms of statistical numbers, right? Because, of course, one of the things Tolkien quite rightly complains about elsewhere is that technology, as he understands the term negatively, has made it possible to kill far larger numbers of people at once than older technology was capable of doing. And that's about its only advantage, if one can put it that way. The painful truth of the matter is, there is no simpler time. There is a statistically slightly less deadly time in terms of the kinds of yearnings that we have. Now, there may be other kinds of yearnings that are easier to satisfy with fantasy escape to an imagined past. We'll talk about that. But as far as simplifying human relations, that simply is not possible. Betsy, you're a bit troubled by this as well. Can you elaborate?
Well, it's kind of just like knowing the human nature. There are always
That's
gonna be
right.
complications
Yes.
between the people around us, no matter what the
Yes.
technology is.
Yeah, in spite of what we might think of as modern behaviorist blank slate thinking, yes, suggesting that human beings are infinitely malleable and therefore the social sciences are the next great exercises in human improvement. The painful truth of the matter, at least as we can see it here, is that human nature is human nature. It does not seem to change significantly over the course of the last 100,000 years. So we yearn for a simpler time, but we cannot simplify human beings, and we cannot simplify human relations. Do you see, in addition, Sam, to the biological complexities and magical complexities you are alluding to, and to which we will return, do any of you see as well manifestations of the complexity of human relationships? Go ahead.
We have Signy,
Yes?
everything connected to Signy.
Yes?
Her relations to her brother, her
Yes.
relations to her children.
Her husband?
Especially her husband, who she both
Yes.
loathes, but
Yes.
decides to die.
Yes.
Her relations to her father.
Mhm.
I do not believe that is simpler than
No, not at all. Do we have, in other words, to build upon what you're suggesting, do we have sets of familial, dynastic, and more broadly social relations that are governed by codes of conduct for violations of which people are punished in one way or another? Do we have those things? Yes, of course we do. Think about it for just a moment. When Signy says, I don't think it's a good idea for me to marry Sagar, she says to her father, terrible things will follow. And he says, well, I've already promised you to him. I can't go back on my word. Hey, folks, that's a social code which is working against the welfare of the people who practice it. A feature that Tolkien himself had already ascribed to the heroic ideology of the Battle of Malden. Where does he get these ideas? Not solely from World War I, though that's plenty, right? That's more than sufficient to give him such ideas. Truth of the matter is, it also is already preconditioned by his reading and his scholarship. Social conventions, which are always complex, compel Volsungs to give his daughter away in marriage to a man she doesn't want to marry, number one, and whose marriage to him, she says, will reduce her family almost to extinction. To which her father's reply is, He shall verherdreth eure maien litlaf. Right? Our strength shall be greater as it lessens. So a statement of heroic code, a code of honor which binds them, from which he cannot let them escape, and which ultimately results in the death of himself. Let's just count it out. If in the Battle of Malden, Bergnoth's pride, his overmode, results in the death of at least his entire household guard, as well as innumerable other lesser soldiers in his fighting group. Is it not also true that Volsung's entrapment in the particular social codes in which he finds himself produces not only his own death, the death of his bride's, his own death, the death of his daughter's children, right? At least 4 of her children. The death of his own 9 sons, and a multitude of deaths on the battlefield on both sides. His force, in point of fact, is wiped out. So in this one moment when he says, well, I gave him my word, I can't go back on it, he commits to death quite literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So it's not simpler by any means, and its consequences, though perhaps not as horrific as modern warfare could make it, and we witness every day, alas, nevertheless are desolating, not simpler. What about things like genitorship, family, parenthood? What about the origins of our children? What about the fates of our progeny? Simpler? I don't think so. Sam, go ahead.
Well, I was just confused by the fact that you brought like the social conventions.
Yes.
And like how he like kept his word, he was a
Yeah,
man of his word.
that's right.
But then if you look at like 55, Signy, whenever she kills her first 2
That's
like
right, yes.
true kids,
Yeah.
because they're not like
They're Sagar's
strong-
children,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Like her actual marriage.
Yeah.
Because they weren't like big and strong
Nope.
like her.
Yeah, they were afraid of
family.
something moving around in a bag of
Yes.
flour, right?
And then
And she's with a
whenever-
couple of chickens, so they don't deserve to live.
We'll just kill them. Yeah. And we were talking about
Yeah.
like social conventions.
Yes.
Parenthood.
Yes, right? So where does parenthood go under those circumstances, right? And thus we also have another layer of complexity. Volsung is bound by his word, and he dies, as it were, heroically as a consequence, but in the same way that Bergnoth dies for his overmode, and through a kind of ideological entrapment. But there's an interesting counter-trend to all of this, as if the participants, and this is one of the things that Morris would especially have loved about the story. He certainly loves its archaism, which he preserves in the choice of terms that he uses, as well as the thing itself. But he also loved this trend in literature of this kind. If on one level we are bound by social convention, and we make our decisions as a consequence of ideological entrapment, are there not figures, characters in the tale who attempt to behave outside, Betsy, of such constraints? Since we've mentioned Signy, it seems to me that basically to correct the atrocity of her marriage to Sagar, she helps to wipe out his progeny, even though she's their mother, right? A very ogreish kind of thing to do, right? Something a troll wife might undertake. But are there other figures who seek to operate counter to convention or against this ideological entrapment? Tell me about their ancestors, or tell me about her twin brother and the son that they do engender. Why is Brandon Stark, if I may use the term for a moment because it's archaic and I mean it to be, why is Brandon Stark crippled? Why is he crippled? Come on, you guys, you're fans, you know why.
Oh, I don't know actual reason.
Yes.
Pushed out of a window.
So he was thrown out of a window. He loved to climb high buildings. He wasn't supposed to be. He was an adventurous child of 10. He loved to climb buildings. And one day when the Lannisters are visiting the Starks, you remember? He climbs the wrong building and looks in the wrong window and he finds Jaime and Cersei in flagrante. And Jaime, cad that he is, as he says, out of love for his sister, seizes Brandon and throws him to the ground, hoping that he will die. He doesn't. So there is already, we know from that episode, a tradition of counter-trend to convention, and it involves, among many other kinds of counter-trends, incest. How does one violate this constraining ideological world in which a father usually says to the daughter, honey, I've picked a husband for you. Hope you like him, but he's the one for you. How do you resist that? How do you fight against it? How do you attempt to go around it? One of the ways might be the way chosen by Signy. Go ahead, James, you can
I was
ask.
to say witchcraft.
Yeah, of course, right. Ultimately, we'll come back to that. Excellent. And of course, in her particular case, witchcraft simply functions as the pretext. She and Sigmund are twins. They already have an affinity. When the other 9 brothers are slain, one by the wolf who comes to eat them in the night. A motif, of course, I trust you also recognize, you fans of the Silmarillion, from the Silmarillion. Yes, it's borrowed nearly verbatim. Honorifically, to be sure, as homage. But when the 9 other brothers are devoured nightly by the she-wolf, and only Sigmund is left, that looks suspiciously like a design of Signy's, as if it was her intent that for her long-term plans, only Sigmund could remain alive. And it is she who contrives then, after the other 9 are dead, to defeat the she-wolf. You may remember how she does it. It's very clever. Betsy, do you recall?
I'm trying to remember the details. It has to do with honey.
Say again? Honey.
Honey.
Yeah, correct. Yes. Go ahead.
He coats himself in honey, so that way the she-wolf goes down to lick him, and he tears off the tongue of
Yes,
the she-wolf,
yeah.
and then kills her.
He tears her tongue out by the roots because he has honey on his face and in his mouth, and he bites down on her tongue when she goes to lick the honey out of his oral cavity. And when he tears the tongue out of her mouth, the presumption is she would bleed to death or die in great agony or whatever. So that now, the agent of their destruction in that particular form, because there are other agents remaining, the agent of their destruction in that particular form is now gone. She cannot testify if she is, in fact, Siggeir's mother in an enchanted form. And it can be reported with some plausibility that all of the Volsungs sons are dead. All except Sigmund, secretly. Also, by the way, speaking of enchanted realms, were you counting the days? We have this protracted 9-night episode in which one by one the other brothers are devoured, then Sigmund is saved, and then years pass, right? So that the first son of Sagar that is sent to him to see if he's adequate to get revenge. He's already about 10 years old. And then another dozen years must pass before the actual son, who is engendered in his turn by enchantment and witchcraft, the true Volsungs, son of Signy and Sigmund. He must come of age. So for all this period of time, Sagar is sitting in his throne room. His oldest son disappears. What? He never came back from the woods. What happened? Where is he? Then his next son disappears. Years pass. And Sagar has not a clue what's going on. What do you suppose is happening here that we're not told about?
Signy has clearly a relationship with the witch.
Yes,
Traded,
that's right.
Parenthood with.
Yes.
So would she be enchanting?
I believe
Sagar too?
and wish to infer that throughout all of this, Sagar is not just stupid, because when we met him, although he was somewhat crude, right? He offered to buy the sword from Barnstock, you remember? In the original, it's Barnstock, not Branstock. I don't know why they translated it this way. He offers to buy it when he couldn't pull it out. That's rather crude on his part. And he's upbraided for it. But he's not stupid, because he's cunning and he knows how to make use of the conventions in which his new father-in-law and brothers-in-law are entrapped. So he's not stupid. So he must be, in some sense, inhabiting an enchanted bubble in which he is clueless about the fates of his sons until it's too late. That gives us another component of complexity. Up until the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, the very decades against which Tolkien was often reacting, the novel, as we know it, the extended prose narrative, continued to be driven by a structural device that resembles the inevitability of fate. A good, satisfying story from, say, Fielding or Dickens or even Thackeray ties up all its loose ends and makes everything that happens look like it should have happened. And that's very gratifying to readers. That's our substitute in the author's persona for the will of God, the divine plan that controls everything. And at a deeper layer, it is the substitute for fate and fatedness. The modern novel, or perhaps we should say the modernist novel, really likes to play with that idea in order, in part, to repudiate it. And that's why you have so many early modernist novels upending our concepts of time and intention and causality and earning their reputation really as a kind of major break with the fiction of the past. But in this story, things do indeed seem to occur as a consequence of fatedness. At Signy's wedding feast, why is there a sword to argue over in the first place? Go ahead.
Oh, Odin likes to meddle.
There is, in fact, a god, a deific figure who intrudes upon the world. And your term meddling seems to me to characterize very accurately what he does. He inserts himself and stirs things up. Did you want to add something?
He also was responsible for the Volsungs line anyway.
That's right. Because, of course, he is the father of Siggy, the founder of the line. So that he has engendered these people for his own specific purposes, whatever they may be, and periodically throughout the narrative, he guides or intrudes upon or deflects what is to happen. How is he depicted when we do see him in an avatar form? What does he look like? Joe, do you recollect?
He comes to men and looks like an old man usually.
Yes.
With one eye.
Yes, with one eye, and a big slouch hat, and a blue or gray cape. He also, of course, therefore, would look like a progenitor of a familiar figure from more modern narratives. Who would that be?
I'll go say Gandalf.
That would be Gandalf, right? Although he is not, in fact, the direct progenitor of Gandalf, for reasons we'll talk about at some point. Nevertheless, that figure with its big hat and its cloak, often gray, certainly reminds us that Tolkien's been reading this material and modeling some of his characters, either loosely or explicitly, on some of them. You're going to add something, Betsy.
Was it, just from the Norse class, he's also depicted as like a traveler as well?
Yes,
So-
right, a wanderer, right, as Wagner names him, right? He's a wanderer, a traveler. He goes about meddling in the affairs of men, guiding and directing them to his own ends. What ends have you been able to infer so far? What is he aiming at? He's doing things that cause mass destruction. There's no getting around it. What is he doing it for?
He's collecting all the best warriors.
Yes. What we come to discover, of course, is that in terms Tolkien himself borrows from Morris, Odin is Odin the Goth, Odin the Necromancer, the Wizard of the Dead. And what he does is collect dead warriors for his purposes at the end of time. And we'll come back to that as we go along. So if Odin is present, or if any of his servants are present, they may guide you to victory, as they have guided Volsung to victory after victory after victory. He is a lineal descendant of Odin. And Odin has showed his family special favor. Has that kept them alive? Oh, he laughed with a gallows laugh. No, certainly not. What happens to Volsung? He says not only, well, I've given him my word, so you have to marry him, Signy. When he's invited to a feast a few months later, she meets him at the shore of Sagar's kingdom and says, don't come ashore, go back home, get more men, because Sagar plans to ambush and kill you. And what does he say to that? Go ahead, please.
It's kind of like a, if I die, so be it.
Yeah. I've been in many fights, he seems to suggest, and I've been victorious in all of them. So here's one more. And guess what? That's overmode, right? Odin's support is withdrawn. Why? Because Volsung is old. It's time for the next generation to take over. It's time for Odin's descendants to be tested. And it's time for Volsung to go to Valhalla. We're going to need you up there. So there is in the narrative a very distinct sense that the events are being guided by forces greater than human beings, that these events have been kick-started, in fact, by the very guide who continually meddles in them, and that the consequences for each and every participant are fatal. So this is a story, indeed, in part, about the consequences of the actions of Odin the Goth, Odin the Necromancer, Odin the Lord of the Dead, or as Tolkien also phrases it, the Lord of Crows, right? You eat the dead. Bless you. Under such circumstances, it becomes very clear that the counter-social trends we've been talking about, those which go against standard convention, mothers don't kill their children, wives are obedient to their husbands and fathers. The counter-trends are themselves driven by Odin. Because Odin is not bound by the laws of men. He may be bound by other laws, but he's not bound by the laws of men. And so in order to accomplish his purposes, he may regularly have to subvert the conventions which men adhere to, at least nominally. What kind of a world does that actually produce, as far as you are able to see? There's a world in which men have rules and laws and very complicated social relations and codes of conduct, though they don't always adhere to them. And there is a supernatural deity above them who says when it's expedient, screw all that, go ahead and kill your children, Signe. What kind of a world, Joe, does that produce?
Chaotic.
It is a world not unlike the one Tolkien depicts in The Homecoming of Bergnoth. Think about it for a moment. It's a world in which carrion is plentiful. It's a world in which men can actually be used against their own codes, can be incited to behave in ways that their codes forbid. And it produces chaos. It's a world of murder and slaughter and battle. And it's a world in which these things are the preeminent instruments by which Odin accomplishes his will. Well, friends, I want to suggest to you that that's rather bleak. That's a bleak view of the situation in which human beings find their conditions. Are there any redemptive qualities such as Tolkien, the Catholic Christian, would be looking for in the narrative as far as you have gone? I'm assuming, by the way, that at the very least, if you take the narrative purely, you would be up to probably about page 80, 82, say the end of chapter 12, right? You should be at least that far. Insofar as you've gone, have you found a redemptive channel or component, such as Tolkien might say, involves recovery, escape, consolation? Go on.
I'm not sure it's something that would have consulted Tolkien.
Himself, yes.
But it is true that it's not innate in men, this chaos, that it's handed upon them by the actions of someone else, not bound by them.
Yes. So that there's a sense here in which, though human nature is always the same, that must surely mean that human beings are always a mixture of good and evil. And that in turn must mean there is always some element of good to work against evil. What in this case would the element of good involve? Are there other codes, perhaps?
The generation, the generation of Volsungs always continues, no matter how many of them.
Survival.
Yeah, survival.
Right? Persistence, a kind of courageous and almost inextinguishable fire in the Volsungs themselves, whatever other atrocities they may be associated with, whether inflicted upon them or, as we have seen, inflicted by them. There is always, up through the career of Sigurd himself, a persistent, heroic impulse to continue, to survive, and to attain. All of these men in the Volsung line, and we'll talk about the women too, all of these men in the Volsung line, it has to be said, are endowed with extraordinary courage. They do not appear to be afraid of death. They do not appear to go out of their way to avoid it. They are perfectly ready to engage in heroic deeds, and as we shall see, even against opponents who are far stronger than they. So now, whether in the end that is a manifestation of good or of evil remains to be examined. But there it is. Heroism, courage, persistence, ambition, even, in a fundamental sense. And let's come back to the women for just a moment. Signy in particular. But also there are others. There's Hjordis, late in the section that you were to have read for today, who becomes Sigurd's mother, Sigmund's last wife, right? When she receives 2 marriage proposals, one from Sigmund, one from, who's the other guy? I've forgotten now.
It's on page 79.
Thanks. Anyway, when she receives 2 marriage proposals, one from Sigmund and one from a rival, her father says to her, "I've picked one for you." Is that true? Say? Yeah, Lyngvi, yeah. Her father says, "I've picked one for you." No? That turns out not to be so. It was true in the case of Signy. It's not true in the case of Hjordis. What does he say to her instead, Danielle? Do you recall?
He says that she is free to choose.
That's right. Why is she free to choose? Is he just an indulgent father?
I think he trusts her judgment.
Well, that's the thing. She's wise. He entrusts it to her judgment. It's not because he's weak and can't make up his mind. It's because he knows she's wise. And because he has recognized her wisdom, he has also exalted her to a person with a degree of free choice. At no point does he say to her, "Well, you don't have to get married at all." Right? Almost inconceivable. But he does say you can choose which one is the better match. And she chooses Sigmund. Even though, as she says, he's been through a few winters. He's been around the block more than a few times. Why does she do that? What does her wisdom tell her? It doesn't tell her that they're going to be happy. What might it tell her instead? We have to intuit this. Why does she make the choice she makes, Lacey?
Wasn't one of her lines of thought like, oh, he's not going to live that much longer?
It might well be, right? Yeah. He's been around the block a few times. I'm much younger. He'll die and I'll be queen. Maybe. That sounds like Cersei, of course. But perhaps we might also want to recognize that in her wisdom, she may be foresighted. And if she's foresighted, she knows what the dying Sigmund later himself tells her. She will give birth to a son who will be the greatest and most memorable hero as long as the world lasts. Now, that's an absurd claim, to be sure, but within the created world of this saga, it can be construed to be true. We'll pause there and come back next time. Do another 40 pages or so, if you don't mind, okay? See you then.